Grant Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. Yes, and thank you, my colleague Ruth Dyson, for that support. Can I also begin my contribution with some acknowledgements? I'm not a person who has been on the Select Committee or been close to this bill, but I do want to acknowledge my colleague Ian Lees-Galloway for the work that he has done, and from our point of view, on the opposition benches on this issue. We went into this discussion deeply worried that we had a piece of legislation that was going to entrench what all of us know have been some of the most discriminatory and exploitative practices that I've seen from people coming into my office, and I'm going to return to a couple of cases in a moment. And to now be sitting here tonight with a piece of legislation that will effectively outlaw those contracts, I think is a real achievement, and I want to, from our side, acknowledge Ian Lees-Galloway for that. But I also want to acknowledge the Minister for that, because I think the Minister has entered into this in the spirit of trying to find a way through getting rid of those most exploitative of practices. And so I want to acknowledge the Minister for doing that as well. And as he has noted, what is big and what is small is often in the eye of the beholder. Maybe a topic the member knows about, I don't know, but it is a change that we think is important and valuable on this side of the House. Mr Chair, I want to talk about the same clauses, and I don't think there's going to be any difficulty in a number of members talking about these same clauses, because they are the critical clauses within the bill. And it is within Clause 87 around the topics of availability and cancellation of shifts. And my colleague Ian Lees-Galloway said his definition of 0 hours contracts was a permanent part-time position with no fixed hours. I think that's a nice, clear, concise definition. But for me, it is the people that I have met who have been in these circumstances who define what a 0 hours contract is. And I have two cases that I've dealt with, and I want to use them to explain what I think has been changed here and why I think it's important, particularly in Clause 87, the new section 67E2 around availability of hours. A young woman who is a retail worker, or is actually a student, but was a retail worker over the last 2 summers, found herself in the position of being on call. And it was precisely the point that Mr Woodhouse just made before, where the reasonable assumption of her employer was, I might be busy, I might not be busy, but I want you to be ready at a moment's notice for me. And this person who wanted work over the summer period, needed work over the summer period, was struggling to find it, accepted a contract that, quite frankly, they shouldn't have. And had they had advice from a union right off the bat, they probably wouldn't have either. But they did. This woman did do that. And she found herself in almost exactly the position we've just been discussing in the last 2 interventions, of being told to come in. The employer would let her stay for about an hour sometimes. If it wasn't busy, and this is literally true, if it was raining, or if there was a forecast of rain, she'd be told to go home because people wouldn't be coming out to shop. And that is as bad and as ridiculous as it got for that worker. My understanding of reading the availability provision here is the vital importance of the linkage between availability and guaranteed hours. Agreed hours of work and guaranteed hours. That's the absolutely critical connection that's been missing. That the ability for an employer to exploit a clause that didn't link those two things together is the concern that we've had on our side of the House. And I take the point that there will be some employers who've just been a bit slack, they haven't really tightened up on how to do this. That's a fair comment. Unfortunately, as we always find in employment legislation, there are that very small minority of employers who actually do this deliberately, who go out of their way to find the loopholes and exploit them and exploit the employees who work for them. We have to have law that stops that. It's not about judging all employers as being bad. It's not. Most employers want to do the best by the workers in their firms. But we have to make law that deals with those who have the worst intent. It's the sad thing. It's about what we have to do in this House from time to time, and tonight is one of those examples. So Clause 67E2 is the provision, I do agree with my colleague Ian Lees-Galloway, that makes that connection and makes it understandable, I think, for people. I do take the point the Minister's just made that the employer's got to have a good reason Mr. Chair.
Grant Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, that's good. There was so much competition. I'm so pleased you chose me, Mr. Chair. The employer must have a good reason for requiring the employee to be available for work, and I do respect the fact that those two things go together. So the availability clause is not only about linking the guaranteed hours and the availability provision, but also about making sure that the employer has that good reason. And that will be tested, I suspect, in time. But I think we've heard already in the debate tonight from the Minister and my colleague that the intent of what has been put on the table here is that is quite a high threshold. And I just want to reiterate that point the Minister made. It's a very accurate one about, you know, I might not be busy. I think we've got to make that point that is actually not going to be acceptable in the future, and that is a very, very good thing. Mr. Chair, I want to talk in the second part of my call about the question of cancellation of shifts, and this relates to a different area where someone came to see me, which is around the area of home care and those people who have contracts to do home care. And the example that was given to me was around what happens to a home care worker when the person that they are looking after spends time in hospital. And what are they contracted for? And this will be an interesting case to follow through over time with this new law. Because the current status of a home care worker, if the person that they look after is taken into hospital under emergency circumstances, they're not paid. And that's actually a direct result of the contract that is awarded to the provider, who then passes it on to the person who delivers that. The person who came and saw me about that really was struggling to make ends meet because our home care workers are paid so poorly, but was finding that the inconsistency of income and the cost on her was very, very high. And what that fundamentally comes down to is a question around the cancellation of shifts. And so we now have a very, and I'm not pretending today to say I know exactly what the outcome will be for that worker. But what I can see in the new 67G and the various amendments, both the Minister's and Ian Lees-Galloway in 67G, is that there is now a much more clear process and a series of steps that should, in most good contracts, and that will be the critical element for the case of the person I was dealing with, in most good contracts should be able to eliminate people being exploited by cancellation of shift issues. So let's be clear, we haven't gone through this yet so far. The new clause 67G 2 and 3 now reads that the employer must not cancel a shift of the employee unless the employee's employment agreement specifies a reasonable period of notice that must be given before the cancellation of shift, and reasonable compensation that must be paid to the employee if the employer cancels a shift of the employee without giving the specified notice. In cancelling a shift, the employee must give the notice specified in the agreement, and if that notice is not given, pay the employee specified the compensation. That is a critical change. It is a change that puts in place a regime that means there can be none of the last-minute cancellation because the weather changes or whatever else it is. We actually have to find, we'll find rather that as this goes through, I'm sure the cases that will come will understand what reasonable period of notice is and what reasonable compensation is, but those words are critical in avoiding those problems. So when we put together the availability provisions and the issues around cancellation of shifts, we cut to the heart of the big problems that the Labor Party had when this legislation came forward, and why we were concerned that actually it became a charter for zero-hour contracts rather than the other way. I respect the Minister's different point of view on that, but that's certainly how it felt from our side. Mr. Chair, these provisions mean that as a Parliament, we are making a very important statement tonight about what constitutes decent work in our country. And that means a lot to those people who work in the hospitality industry and the service industry in particular. They do important work for us. We hear a lot from the government at the moment about the importance of tourism and how important tourism is. These are the people who tourists see. If they feel they're valued, if they feel that they've got decent work, that they've got guarantees that they will be valued and their contribution valued and that they will be paid properly, they will be even better ambassadors for our country. In the same way that those who work in the service industry looking after older people, looking after the disabled, These are the people we charge with looking after the most vulnerable in our society, and we are giving them a chance at decent work tonight.